Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about robots and how they're going to change the world. We've got some awesome insights from a recent conversation with some robotics experts at a company called sliQue. In this conversation, we'll hear from Michael Kessler and Sina Moghimi, who, by the way, is their CTO and has a PhD in computer vision, as well as Sathya, a senior software engineer there. They had some really strong and sometimes even controversial opinions.
I'm really curious to hear what they have to say. Like, are we talking about robots taking over the world kind of stuff, or more like how they'll affect our daily lives?
Well, it's actually a bit of both. One of the things that really struck me was Michael's perspective on how companies should approach innovation, especially when it comes to really new technology.
Okay, what's those in?
He believes that companies shouldn't waste time asking people what they want. Instead, they should just show them what they need.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
So basically, he's saying people don't know what they want until they see it.
Exactly. He used the iPhone as a perfect example. Like back in the day, nobody was really asking for a phone without a keyboard. But then Apple came along and boom, the iPhone changed everything.
That's a good point. I mean, would anyone have ever thought we'd be walking around with these tiny computers in our pockets if someone hadn't shown us it was possible?
Right. And Sina and Satya totally agreed. They even brought up Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook as another example of how sometimes the most revolutionary ideas aren't driven by consumer demand, but by someone with a vision for something totally new.
So are they saying that robots are going to be the next iPhone or Facebook? Like something we don't even know we need yet?
Kind of. Sina and Satya believe that robots are going to become as common as mobile phones. Like imagine robots everywhere you look.
Okay, now that's where I get a little skeptical. I mean, robots everywhere. That sounds like a scene from a sci-fi movie.
I know it sounds crazy, right? But they think that once people see how robots can benefit their lives, they'll be totally on board.
So what kind of benefits are we talking about here? Will robots be doing our laundry and making us dinner?
Well, Satya mentioned that robots could lead to increased efficiency and accuracy in a lot of areas. Like, think about all those tedious, repetitive tasks that we all hate doing. Robots could take those over, freeing up our time for more meaningful stuff.
Okay, that does sound pretty appealing. No more folding laundry. Sign me up.
Right. And it's not just about convenience. Sina believes that with the rise of AI, especially these things called large language models or LLMs, robots will be able to interact with us on a whole new level.
LLMs. I've heard that term before. They're like the brains behind those chatbots that are getting so good at sounding human, right?
Exactly. And they're being used to help robots understand and follow complex instructions. Plus, they even talked about vision language task models, which means robots are getting much better at understanding what they see and how to interact with the world around them.
So, like, you could tell a robot to clean up this mess, and it would actually know what to do. No more complicated programming or anything.
That's the idea. But of course, with any major technological advancement, there are going to be some ethical and social challenges. One of the biggest ones they discussed was the impact on jobs.
Right. Automation has always been a concern when it comes to jobs. Are they saying robots are going to take everyone's jobs?
Well, they acknowledge that automation can lead to job displacement, but they also had some pretty radical ideas about how to address that. Sina and Satya actually advocate for higher taxes on companies that replace human workers with robots.
Interesting. So basically, making it more expensive for companies to use robots instead of people. What would that money be used for?
They propose using that tax revenue to fund a universal basic income, which would provide a safety net for folks whose jobs are displaced by automation.
That's a pretty big idea. It definitely raises questions about how our economy and society would need to adapt in a world where robots are doing more of the work.
Exactly. And then they got into this whole debate about robot rights.
Robot rights, like should robots be able to vote and stuff?
Well, not quite that extreme, but the question is, should robots have any rights at all? Michael is totally against the idea. He says robots are just machines, and humans are the only ones who deserve rights.
I can see his point. Robots are tools, right? They're created to serve us, not the other way around.
Right. But Satya brought up an interesting concern. He's worried about the potential for manipulation if robots were given rights. Like, if someone could control a robot, could they then exploit its rights for their own benefit? It gets kind of complicated.
Yeah, it definitely raises a lot of ethical dilemmas that we'll need to grapple with as robots become more sophisticated. Like, at what point does a machine become more than just a machine?
And speaking of ethical dilemmas, they also brought up the issue of bias in AI, which has been a big topic lately.
Oh yeah, I've been hearing a lot about that, like how AI systems can reflect and even amplify existing biases in society.
Exactly. Michael actually mentioned a case involving Tesla, where bias in their AI models was exposed, and it led to some pretty discriminatory outcomes.
That's really concerning. It shows how important it is to have checks and balances in place to make sure AI is developed ethically.
Absolutely. And Satya stressed the importance of having diverse perspectives involved in the development process. He believes that if you have people from different backgrounds working on these systems, they're more likely to catch and correct potential biases.
It makes sense. The more diverse the team, the less likely they are to have blind spots.
Right. And here's where things get really interesting. Michael actually believes that.
Well, he believes that we're already living in a world subtly shaped by robots, even if we don't always see them.
It's kind of like they're working behind the scenes, right? Influencing things without us even realizing it.
Exactly. He thinks robots are already integrated into our lives in ways we might not even be aware of.
Like, what kind of things are we talking about here? Are we talking about, like, robot butlers serving us breakfast or something?
Not quite, haha. But think about it. All those algorithms that curate your social media feeds, or those automated systems that control traffic lights, those are essentially robots making decisions based on data and programming.
Hmm. You're right. I guess I never really thought of it that way before. Those things are kind of like invisible robots, aren't they?
Exactly. They're working behind the scenes, shaping our online experiences, managing our cities, even influencing the products we buy.
That's actually kind of freaky when you think about it. Like, how much of our lives is already controlled by algorithms and automation without us even knowing it?
It's a good question, and it's something we need to be more aware of. As robots become more sophisticated and integrated into our lives, that influence is only going to grow.
So where do we go from here? I mean, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? It really depends on how we manage this transition and ensure that AI and robotics are developed and used ethically.
Sina and Satya seem to think that the benefits outweigh the risks. They believe robots can make our lives easier, safer, and more efficient.
They brought up some interesting points about how robots could take over dangerous jobs, work tirelessly without breaks, and even perform tasks with a level of precision that humans just can't match.
Yeah, like imagine a world where robots are doing all the risky construction work or handling hazardous materials. That would definitely save a lot of lives.
Right, and they could also handle those repetitive, mundane tasks that no one really enjoys doing.
Like data entry or cleaning toilets. I could definitely use a robot for that.
Uh-huh, exactly. But, of course, there are concerns too, like what happens to the people whose jobs are displaced by robots?
That's a big one for sure. Sina and Satya actually suggested higher taxes on companies that replace human workers with robots to fund a universal basic income.
It's a radical idea, but it could be a way to ensure that everyone benefits from the rise of automation, not just the companies that are implementing it.
I wonder how that would work in practice. It definitely raises a lot of questions about how our economy and society would need to adapt.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of ethics in AI, which we touched on earlier. As AI gets more powerful, it's even more important to ensure that it's developed and used responsibly.
Remember that Tesla case Michael mentioned? It really highlights the potential for AI to perpetuate existing biases if we're not careful.
Exactly. We need to make sure that AI is developed with diversity and inclusion in mind, and that we have checks and balances in place to prevent bias from creeping into these systems.
Michael was a big advocate for open and transparent development in the AI field. He thinks that's the best way to ensure that everyone has a voice and that we can catch potential problems early on.
It makes sense. The more eyes we have on the code, the more likely we are to spot and address potential biases or ethical concerns.
Okay, so we've got robots potentially taking over jobs, the whole AI bias thing, and then there's also the question of whether robots should have rights.
Yeah, that was a pretty interesting debate. Michael was totally against the idea of robot rights, but Satya brought up some valid points about the potential for manipulation if robots were granted certain rights.
Like, what if someone could hack into a robot and exploit its rights for their own gain? That could get really messy.
Right, and it also raises philosophical questions about what it means to be sentient or conscious. Like, at what point does a machine become more than just a machine?
It's almost like we're getting into science fiction territory here, but these are questions we're going to have to grapple with as AI and robotics continue to advance.
Absolutely. And speaking of science fiction, remember that point Michael made about how, well, Michael believes that we're already living in a world shaped by robots, even if we don't always realize it.
It's a fascinating concept. He thinks they're operating behind the scenes, influencing our choices and experiences in subtle ways.
Right. It's kind of like they're pulling the strings and we're just dancing along.
It's a little unnerving when you put it like that.
I know. But think about it. All those algorithms that personalize your online experience.
Like the ads we see, or the news that pops up in our feeds.
Exactly. Those are basically robots making decisions based on your data.
Okay, now that you mention it, that makes sense.
And it's not just online. Think about things like traffic lights or those automated systems that control power grids.
Or even robots working in factories and warehouses.
Right. They're everywhere, shaping our world without us really noticing.
It's almost like we take it for granted how much of our lives is automated these days.
And as robots get more advanced, that automation is only going to increase.
So that brings us to a big question. Are we really ready for all this?
It's a tough one. There's so much potential for good, but also a lot of potential downsides.
Yeah, like we talked about before, job displacement, AI bias, the whole robot rights debate.
We really need to think carefully about how we manage this transition to a more automated world.
So what can we do? What's our role in all of this?
Well, first off, we need to stay informed.
Like actually learn about this stuff, not just ignore it.
Right. Understand how this technology works and what the potential impacts are, both the good and bad.
And then what? Do we just write our congressman?
Well, engaging with policymakers is definitely important. Let them know that this is something you care about.
But it's more than that, right? Like it's about our everyday choices too.
Absolutely. Be mindful of the tech you use and how it collects your data. Support companies that are committed to ethical AI.
Use your voice to advocate for responsible development.
Exactly. This is our future, and we all have a role in shaping it.
I guess the main takeaway here is that we shouldn't just be passive bystanders. We need to be actively involved in this conversation.
Absolutely.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. Getting people thinking critically about these complex topics.
Exploring different perspectives.
And hopefully coming away with a better understanding of how we can create a future where AI and robotics benefit everyone.
So keep exploring, keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.